Many right now have probably asked themselves the question about why Russia is so expansionistic, historically and today. My answer to this question would be that it is a legacy of both historic, cultural and geographic factors. And I think it's best to start with the geographic factors first. As some of you in my audience might know, the area of Russia has had a history of getting invaded several times, especially in early history before even the Terrible, during the Muscovy era and earlier, but also afterwards, in later Russian history. For example, from the beginning you have various nomadic peoples coming from the east that wander through the area that will later become Russia, attacking the people living there. Then later you have Slavic peoples getting enslaved by Nordic peoples and sold in the Middle East. A threat coming from the northwest, but also caused by the southern Islamic political entities in the south and their demand for slavery. And later you have a long list of other invasions.
The Mongols,
The Swedish Empire's invasion attempts, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth's invasion attempts, the French under Napoleon, the Germans, and also other groups and powers that I have not mentioned. It is in the shadow of these invasions that the Russian state appears and grows, and the initial politics of expansion for the Muscovy city-state that Russia evolved from has its roots in the fact that there are not many natural barriers on the Russian steppes against invasion. Thus, the Muscovite city-state had to create distance in order to create offense in depth as their defensive strategy to survive all of these invasions that were always coming. And thus, expansion becomes the natural strategy to create distance, to create security. However, constantly invading other areas and expanding means getting a very large territory under you. And thus, there are very large territories within what is to become the Russian domain. And these are large areas and regions that often have very different local needs, peoples, cultural traditions, and political structures locally. Russia becomes and is in area the Earth's largest country, and historically was and still is one of the most culturally diverse countries on Earth. And I mean truly different cultures, with extremely different worldviews and fundamental ideas about how the world works. We have nomadic and settled peoples existing within the Russian borders, even to this day. We even have some people that were pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherers until very recently, when they began to settle within Russia. We have peoples with languages that are not even distantly related to Russian, being the majority in various regions of Russia. We have a plurality of religions, with certain regions of Russia that has a majority of Muslims or even animist beliefs, that say beliefs in spirits and such, and not with a majority of Orthodox Russian Christians. We have people that live in deserts, tundra, woodlands, or along coasts within the Russian territory. With these large regions of territory and the diversity that comes along with it, comes a wish for and a need for strong local regional power, often in the form of strong local nobility, that often have very contradictory demands and needs with other regions of Russia and with the central power of Russia. And in the worst cases, this also leads into separatism and secession movements, internal armed conflicts that are taken advantage of by outer enemies of Russia, historically. See, for example, the Time of Troubles as an example of this, which was a period of political chaos, in much caused by conflicts between various factions of nobility in Russia, and which was taken advantage of by several outer entities, such as by Sweden and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Russia, with such an amount of contradictory interests coming from various local powers, has always had a need for a strong centralized absolutist rule, as it is required here in order to steer Russia and in order to get some sort of unified state. This is arguably why the Romanovs came into power after the time of troubles and really created this centralized Russian rule as we knew it. This centralized rulership has also been necessary as Russia has been exposed historically to several very brutal invasions even after the times of troubles. However, Russia, after Ivan the Great and Ivan the Terrible after him, and especially during the Romanov dynasty and later Soviet Union, is too big to have all the power concentrated just in the centralized rulership. Thus, local powers and regionalism has been respected to a certain degree. You can even see it today with Kadyrov being the leader of Chechnya inside of Russia. Local power and a certain level of distinctiveness away from Russian norms has been allowed, as it would be impossible to more or less homogenize and harmonize everything within Russia or rule directly in everything. It would also risk creating even more internal conflicts, which could be taken advantage of by outer enemies historically, and it is even feared today. Hence, you have strong local rulership that answers directly to the leader of Russia. These can be boyar nobility, local rulers appointed by the Tsar, or various regional directors during the Soviet times, and now we have regional governors during the Russian Federation. Their function is to be the link between the centralized rulership and the local regions and the people there. Again, Kadyrov as an example. And just like Kadyrov sometimes complains to Putin about various matters, so have these local people and local leaders also had their own ambitions and wills and interests within Russia. And these are often conflicting with each other and conflicting with the will of the centralized authority. So the tension has always been there between the centralized absolutist ruler, who more or less must use tyrannical power in order to get anything done within Russia, and the various local powers and peoples, and their ambitions and wills. This natural disunity must be counteracted in some way, from the viewpoint of the ruler of Russia. So, you unify against an outer enemy. You create unity for having an outer enemy to unite against, be it the unorthodox West during the times of the Tsars, the capitalists or the Nazis during the time of the Soviet Union, and the more recent liberal Western hegemony threat used by Putin today. And there are arguments that various nationalist elements and various sorts of discontentment with Putin's rule has made him be more aggressive and seeking enemies outside in order to justify his own rule. And thus the conquest of Ukraine would have been a part of this. And since wars and expansion has been the go-to way to unify Russia, the result of this policy has been naturally expansion of the territory, which creates more of the same problem of disunity in the long run. But temporarily, it also brings more resources for further expansion and wars further down the line that can be used to secure the power of the centralized rulership in Russia. Thus, Russia has historically been caught in this cycle of expansion and need to expand further. However, every reason is not geographical. There are cultural factors too that have contributed to aggressive expansionism. And let me state something that might be seen as very controversial today with everything going on. And that is that Russia is an European culture at its core, not much different from other European cultures. The clearest example of this is the European time-honored tradition of trying to imitate the Roman Empire. Just like every other European culture, Russia has seen Rome as the foundational empire to imitate. Ever since Ivan the Terrible adopted the title of Tsar, that is to say Caesar or Emperor, Russia has seen itself as the third Rome following the fall of Constantinople, capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, in the year 453 to the Ottoman Islamic Turks. And, like Rome, Russia sees itself as an empire that demands glory and expansion. So that exists too as a motivation. In this manner, Russian imperialism, historically, is not that different from other European imperial projects that have been trying to revive the glory of Rome. What is different, however, is that Russia adopted Roman Orthodox Christianity, and thus belongs to the Orthodox Eastern Roman world, historically. A world whose center, Constantinople, was conquered by the Islamic Turks, and the Eastern Roman Empire was imagined, and even is imagined to this day, as always having been invaded and always being on the back foot, being the invaded one, not the invader. An imagined world constantly under siege. A fate that Russia has historically motivated their policies to avoid. And this imagination of sharing the risk of being a world under siege by un-Christian enemies has not been helped by the Russians themselves actually getting invaded several times by unorthodox enemies and almost forcibly converted under, for example, the time of troubles by Sweden or the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And this view of being a world under siege was continued under the Soviet times, but with a different motivation. Instead of orthodoxy versus the unorthodox world, you had the capitalist West or the Nazis against the communist Russian world. And you have also ideas about nationalism and about Russians being under siege, generally, outside of Russia, and Russia needing to help them, or the Russian world will be under even greater threat. Pretty much just an extension about this cultural mentality of wanting to avoid the fate of the Eastern Roman Empire, of being under threat, under siege. Here is also another method that exists, and that has to do with the fact that other peoples that surround Russia, such as the Ukrainians and the Belarusians, have been seen as just being small Russians, and viewed in context of the enormous diversity of peoples that exist within Russia, that are even more different from mainline Russians than the Ukrainians or the Belarusians. Viewing Belarusians and Ukrainians as Russians has made some sense from the Russian perspective. However, this also means that Ukrainian independence and a possible future independent Belarusia would be seen as a threat, as a secession of a part of the Russian world, the Ruski Mir, this Orthodox Russian world that is always under the risk of getting besieged by enemies, of getting invaded, but also in need of having the glory of being the third Rome. This juxtaposition has always existed in the cultural world, and often been promoted by the rulership in Russia, and has created a culture that feels constantly at risk of getting invaded and being under siege and ending like the Eastern Roman Empire, but also at the same time demands the expansion and the domination of surrounding countries, just like Rome, and also as a buffer for safety to avoid the fate of Rome. And while it is true that the leadership often has tried to spread this cultural view of the world, it has often itself either believed in it or been forced to take it into consideration due to the demands of expansion that this culture has created among various Russian factions. There is a reason why Russian leaders that have failed to expand the Russian borders and lost territory have not been long-lasting, generally, as they have been seen to have broken with this ideal about expansion. This cultural worldview of being a world under threat in a similar way to the Eastern Roman Empire, together with the geographical factors, is what has made Russia so expansionistic historically and today. What do you think about this, my dear viewer? Or you might have a question. Please post any comment you would like, and I will respond to it as quickly as possible. Please do subscribe as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities. اشترك بالقناة من فضلكم.